hi guys! No, in this video you're not going to be watching me play games. Instead, in this exciting visual effects tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create your own epic 3D intro title that you can use for your own videos or your YouTube gaming channel. In this tutorial we will be using Adobe After Effects, and we will also use the Element 3D plugin from VideoCopilot. Now, I am going to assume that you are pretty comfortable using Adobe After Effects, that you know all about cameras and animating stuff and expressions, so this is going to be an intermediate tutorial. If you're just getting started, I highly recommend you check out some of the beginner tutorials I have on my channel first, and I also already have a video that covers how to use the Element 3D plugin. But now, before I bore you to death, let's jump right into the tutorial. I'm just gonna finish this round, okay? Okay. I know you've seen it before, but here's the title that we are going to create in this tutorial. One important thing to keep in mind, especially if you are creating the title for your YouTube channel, is to keep the title nice and short. If you intend to use the title on all of the videos that you put on YouTube and the title is longer than 10 seconds, people are just gonna get bored and they're either gonna skip your title or click away from your video altogether. For exactly those reasons, the empty composition that I already have set up is 10 seconds long. Now, before we get started on the text, let's quickly whip up a background for the title. Obviously, you can do that in any way that you like. However, I do tend to like the very simple gradients. So let's create a new solid and let's call this one background. Go over into the effects and presets panel and search for the radial gradient effect. Apply the effect to your background layer and you will end up with a simple gradient in the middle of your composition. Go into the effects control panels and let's expand the inner radius and the outer radius properties. Both of these contain color pickers that you can use to define the color at the inside and at the outside of your gradient. So let's change the outer color to a nice dark red. And let's change the inside to a warm yellow. Now, I'm kind of going with the Surface Studio colors. Obviously, feel free to use whatever colors you like. Next, increase the opacity of the outer radius to 1 so that the outside of the gradient fills with the background color, which is our dark red. And let's increase the outer radius to just widen out and soften out this gradient. That looks quite good. Let's increase the smooth value just to soften out the gradient a little bit more. And I think I'm also going to jack up the outer radius just a little bit further. And what I want to do, let's expand the center property and let's just move the position. You can actually just grab it in the middle here as well. Let's just move that down a little bit so the glow seems to be coming center bottom a little bit more rather than just being fully centered in the composition. I think I'll make the red just a little bit warmer. Yeah, that looks a lot better. Obviously, whenever you're working with gradients, make sure that in your project panel, your project is set to use 32 bits per channel. Otherwise, your gradients might end up looking rather blocky and ugly. Now let's start to add the text for our title. Let's create a new text layer and then simply type whatever name or title you want to appear. Pick a font that you like to have for your title. I'm actually quite happy with Showcard Gothic, and you can change the size, but it's not actually going to make much of a difference once we add Element 3D. Now let's create a new solid. Let's call this one Element 3D and hit OK. Go into your effects panel and let's search for the element effect from VideoCopilot and apply it to our Element 3D layer. Because we want to extrude the text layer that we've just created, what we have to do in the settings for Element 3D, you're going to have to open up the custom layers property and under custom text and masks, set the path layer 1 to, well, in this case, Toby Games, which is the text layer that you've created for your title. Be aware that I am using version 2 of the Element 3D plugin here. Obviously, that means some of the options that I'll show you in this tutorial may not be available if you're still on version 1, but you can either just leave them out or set up something else. It just looks cool and works with the title you want to create. Because we are going to use Element 3D to create a 3D version of our title, we don't actually need to see this text layer anymore, so we can just disable the visibility. Then reselect your Element 3D layer and let's jump into the scene setup. Now this is where the fun begins. Obviously, right now we don't have anything at all, but all we have to do is simply click on Extrude and Element 3D will extrude our first custom path, which is our text layer, into a 3D object. So here it is, our title called Toby Games in this case. Next, what we want to do is we want to style this title in Element 3D, add a few cool bevels and edges and materials just to make it look a little bit more fancy. And again, I can't stress this often enough, feel free to change all of these properties and play around with them, experiment until you find something that you yourself think looks really cool. What I'm showing you here obviously is the way I would do it and the way I would set it up based on my personal preferences, but feel free to experiment, play around until you find something that you think looks really, really cool. Let me push a few of these panels over just so we get a bit more space for the preview and you can see a little bit clearer what is going on. The first thing I always like to do with my 3D models is apply a base material. So let's jump into presets and into the materials folder. Obviously, I do have the Pro Shaders pack, which contains some great shaders. The materials that you have available may differ depending on whether you have the Pro Shaders pack and what version of Element 3D you are using. But again, feel free to use whatever you like. Let's just jump into the metals folder and maybe let's use this one here. It's called Metal Grunge. To apply material, simply drag it onto your extrusion model in your scene editor. And it's as easy as that. Let's zoom in and check this out. That looks pretty cool, I'd say. Now, the resolution of this material is pretty low at the moment, and I am going to jack this up before we do the final render, but I don't want to make the resolution too high right now, simply because it's going to slow down the rendering and me working with the scene. I just want to get a base feel for what this title is going to look like. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bevel to this text. In the extrusion model, in my scene browser, under extrusion, I've got the option for bevel copies, and I'm going to change that over to 2. This is now going to add another bevel, another material into my model. Now, this may look a little bit funny, and I'm not actually sure whether this only happens in version 2, but because the two polygonal meshes that Element 3D created are exactly the same size, the polygons kind of overlap and rendering is a little bit screwed up. However, that is very easy to fix. Simply select the second bevel in your extrusion model, and let's change the Z offset a little bit, and so you can see the second bevel is being pushed out from the original mesh. I just want it sticking out a little bit. Next, I'm going to reduce the bevel size to 0, which is going to bring it in just a little bit from the edges, and so they don't quite overlap anymore. Next, I'm also going to shrink down expand edges, maybe to -1, just to pull the edges in a little bit more, and so the bevel kind of stands out of the center of the text, which looks kind of cool. Yep, I like how this looks. Let's also apply material to this inner bevel that we've created. So let's go back into our materials. And let's find something that looks good. Maybe I'll use a physical shader this time. Maybe let's go with black outline. So simply click and drag the material onto the bevel in your scene browser. Bam! Nice, it looks really cool and shiny. Obviously, again, if you don't have these materials, just use any material that you think will look good on your title. And yes, we still have quite a bit of refinement to do, but as I said, we are going to do that after we've got the initial title sequence set up, just to keep rendering nice and snappy. The last things I want to do before we start with the animation, let's jump over into the environment tab, and let's pick an environment that we like to be reflected on our title. This one looks kind of cool, so you get a little bit of a reflection of the environment. And finally, because we are going to add some light into the scene, you can actually preview what that might look like. Down here you've got a little drop down for light options. Maybe let's try product. Yeah, that looks kind of cool. So it's like red and yellow, which again works very well with the Surface Studio colors. And let's hit OK and return to our composition. Bam! And here's the title right in the center of our composition. Now obviously the text is a little bit small, so let's go into the Element 3D settings, expand group 1, open the particle look, and let's jack up the particle size until the title sits nice and big in the center of the preview screen. Next, I usually like to set up the lights for my scene. You can do this very easily by right-clicking into your timeline window and creating a new light. Let's make this one red-orange, hit OK. And then in your preview window, you can position the light in 3D space relative to your title to light whichever part you want. You may create another light. Let's make this one blue. And let's move this over to the left side. Maybe I'll actually push it behind the title so it lights the title from behind with a nice blue backlight. And then you may create another light. Let's make this one fairly white, maybe with a bit of a reddish tint. Hit OK. And let's move this over to the left side. And you're free to create whatever lights you need to light your scene the way you want. However, if you're feeling a little bit lazy and you don't want to go through the hassle of setting up all of your own lights, Element 3D comes inbuilt with some presets that you can very easily apply to your title. let's delete the 3 lights that we have just created. Let's go back into Element 3D and let's expand the render settings. In the render settings, you will find a lighting tab, and if we expand the lighting tab, you will see that Element 3D by default is set up to use the lights within your composition to light your title. Fortunately, you can also add additional lighting, and in here you will find all of the presets from within Element 3D that you can select and just apply to your title without having to set up any lights in your composition. So let's pick product for this one. Now the lighting does seem rather subtle, so fortunately what you can do is expand the additional lighting tab, and for example let's jack up the brightness. Cool, it's becoming a little bit more obvious. You can also expand the rotation and kind of move the lights that are inbuilt into Element 3D around your title in any way that you want. So let's tweak this a little bit. Yeah, this looks kind of cool, so you're kind of getting a really nice backlit effect here that I really dig. So this looks really, really cool. Again, you can also just not use this and set up your own lights, but if you're being lazy and you just want it to be nice and quick, the preset lightings from Element 3D are a really good option. Next, let's set up the basic animation for our title. And again, this is kind of up to you, but what I imagine this title to look like is all of the letters to start a little bit pushed apart and a little bit randomly rotated. And then as the animation continues, all of the characters kind of come together to form the title, and they all go nice and upright. And then towards the end, they all flip over and vanish left to right, and then the whole thing goes dark. As you've probably guessed, we are going to use Element 3D to create this animation, so let's return to the Element 3D settings. Under Group 1, under the particle look, you may be inclined to open up your particle rotation and start rotating your particles. It doesn't look bad, but you're kind of rotating the entire title because it's considered one object. Let's reset the rotation to 0 and go down a little bit. In your particle look, you will find a multi-object option. Expand this tab and then you will have an option to enable multi-object. Let's tick this. This tells Element 3D to break up your title into individual letters, and you can then animate these letters independently. Let me quickly make this panel a little bit bigger for you. And now if under the multi-object settings in the rotation panel, we increase the rotation random property, you will see that all of the letters of your title get rotated independently. So it's no longer one chunk. They're all broken up into individual letters, and you can create some really cool effects. So let's start creating our animation. Let's go back to the beginning of the composition and let's enable keyframes for rotation random, and let's jack this up to maybe around 120. Doesn't have to be too heavy. And let's go forward. Because we have 10 seconds for the full title sequence, I probably want to be done with the text reveal by about 6 seconds. Give it a few seconds, like 1 or 2 to show, and then by 9, 10 it should already disappear again, because that's when the title should finish. So by about 6 seconds, let's set the rotation to 0. So now what you're going to have is you're going to have an animation with the characters starting out slightly rotated, and they're all coming together towards the end. Next, let's return to the beginning of the composition, and the next property I want to animate is called Displace. Now, Displace is usually referred to as tracking when you're dealing with titles, and what it controls is the spacing of the characters, so you can push them apart and then have them come together, and that's exactly what I want to do. So let's push this up to maybe 0.3 to have the title right up to the edges of the composition. Enable keyframes at 0 seconds. Go forward to 6 seconds where the title is nice and straight. And let's bring this back in, maybe not even all the way to 0. Maybe we'll go with 0.1 just so it's still a little bit spaced out. You can see the characters rotate and they kind of come together to form this nice title. Now, one thing I do with all of my animations, let's go back up to the layer in our timeline view, press U to reveal all of the keyframes, and you're going to see the keyframes on the rotation random and the displace property. Select all of your keyframes and then hit F9 on your keyboard to turn the keyframes to use Bezier interpolation. So the animation is just going to start slow, get a bit faster, and then end slow. It just looks a little bit more organic and not quite so stiff. Next, once the title animation has completed and before we fade out our text, let's add a really cool light sweep that kind of sweeps across the text to just highlight the title. For that, go over into your Effects and Presets panel and search for the CC Light Sweep effect. Let's apply the CC Light Sweep effect to the Element 3D layer. And what it will do is if we drag this center position around, you can see this really cool little light sweep going across. Now, I don't like the angle of the light sweep, so in the CC Light Sweep setting, let's change the direction from -30 degrees to +30 degrees. And yep, cool, that looks better because I do want the light sweep to come left to right across the text. So what I'm going to do is, after the text has come together at about 6 seconds, maybe let's wait about half a second to 6:12. Let's move the light sweep all the way over to the left side. Zoom out a little bit. Because it goes diagonally across, you want to make sure it's far enough over to the left side of your composition. Let's place it about there. Let's place a keyframe on the center property. Let's move up to maybe 7:12. So the light sweep will take exactly 1 second. Let's drag the center all the way across over to the right side. So what's going to happen? If we zoom in a little bit, the title is going to come together and the light sweep is going to come across. Actually, I think it's a little bit late. I think I'd almost like the light sweep to start a little bit quicker. So let's select the layer, press U to reveal all of the keyframes. And here's the one for the light sweep down there. So let's drag them a little bit closer just so that we have the light sweep start soon after the title comes together. So let's preview this. Cool, I think timing-wise this works a lot better. Next, I think I might actually change the color of the light sweep a little bit, and you can do that in the CC light sweep settings just by changing the light color property. Maybe I'll change it to like a light blue, greenish, just something that stands out nice against the red and yellow background. Obviously, again, just change this to whatever you want. You can also go in and change the intensity or the width or other settings of this light sweep to just make it suit the title that you're trying to create. I think this actually looks quite good. There's another really cool light effect that I've started to use in some of my other tutorials, like my proxy tutorial, and it's called CC Light Rays. So let's go over into the Effects and Presets panel and search for the CC Light Rays effect. Let's apply the CC Light Rays effect to the Element 3D layer, and if you drag the center around, the way the CC Light Rays effect works, it kind of creates a highlight, like there's light shining through or reflecting off the object right at the center position. So this, I reckon I want to animate to follow this light sweep coming through so that there's a bit of a spark on top of the light sweep as it's passing through the title. Obviously, we could just try to animate the light rays effect to follow along with the light sweep, but it's much easier and much more precise to do this with expressions. So what I am going to do is I'm going to go down, make sure that my light sweep effect in my timeline is visible with the center position. And I am then going to go into my CC Light Rays effect and Alt-click, like hold Alt down and click onto the center position of the CC Light Rays effect. In the expression editor, type open square bracket, value, open square bracket, 0, close square bracket, plus, and then use the pick whip icon to select the X coordinate of the center property on your CC Light Sweep effect. Cool, that'll insert it into our expression, then comma, value, open square bracket, 1, close square bracket, plus, and then again use the pick whip icon, and this time we're going to select the Y coordinate of the center position for the CC Light Sweep effect. Cool, let's finish off the expression with another close square bracket. Now this expression might look a little bit confusing, but it's actually pretty simple. All it does is add the center position from the CC Light Sweep effect on top of the center position for the CC Light Rays. That means that as the CC Light Sweep animates across the screen, it'll pull along the CC Light Rays effect. So now if we scrub through our composition, you can see the light rays follow along. It's a little bit offset at the moment, but we can simply grab the center for the CC Light Rays effect and position it right on the corner of the title, right where the sweep is. And now if we scrub through the composition, the light ray will be exactly where the light sweep hits our title. Cool, that looks really good. I might actually lower the intensity for the light rays just a little bit so it's not quite so in your face. But I think that actually looks pretty cool. Let's preview this. Yep, cool, I like it. Now finally, let's look at making this text disappear towards the end of our title sequence. There are quite a few ways to achieve this, but to not have this tutorial drag on forever, let's just use the inbuilt animation engine of the Element 3D plugin. It is important to understand that the animation engine of Element 3D basically interpolates between different groups, so it blends between them. In order to have our title disappear, we need to set up another group, group 2, to look exactly like our title but be invisible, and then we can fade from group 1 to group 2 to make our text disappear. Let's jump into the scene setup. Now, before we deal with the groups, one thing I really want to fix up is that on the backside of my title, the bevel isn't actually visible, so the backside looks kind of plain and boring. In order to fix that, let's make sure that the material for our bevel is selected. And let's increase the extrusion option. So this is going to push out the bevel a little bit more. And now let's decrease the Z offset to kind of push the bevel back through our text so it's poking out the other side. Cool, this looks much nicer. So now you've got the bevel showing through on both sides of the title. Now let's get things ready for the fade out animation. In the scene browser, select the group folder, and on the right side you'll have a little drop down that specifies which particle groups this model is assigned to. So right now it's only going to be showing in group 1. So hold down Shift and click on group 2. So this model is now going to be assigned to particle group 1 and particle group 2. Hit OK, and you can already see a second copy of the title in our composition. If you now go into group 2 and expand the particle replicator, and for example, let's jack up the Y position, you can see this is a second copy of our title, which is exactly the same particles or the same 3D elements as we have in group 1, but it's not been set up the same way as group 1 yet. Fortunately, Element 3D makes that very easy as well. So let's go into group 1, close down all of these tabs. At the very bottom you have group utilities. Expand it, go into copy and paste, hit copy on group 1, so hit copy because we want to copy all of these settings. Go into group 2, expand group utilities, copy and paste, and let's paste this into group 2. Bam! It looks like the second group has disappeared, but it hasn't actually. The second one is just perfectly aligned with the first group, and so it looks like one title. If you go into group 2 and move the particle replicator around, you can see the second copy of the title appearing. Let's undo that so they're perfectly aligned again. What I want to do is I want to go into group 2, under particle look, I want to set force opacity, so right now it's 100%, to 0. So basically what this will do, group 1 and group 2 are now perfect copies of this title. They're exactly the same and aligned exactly the same way. Except group 2 is invisible. So if we now fade from group 1 to group 2, the text will disappear. And in order to do that, let's collapse all of these groups. And let's go into the animation engine and say enable animation engine. Under group selection, we are going to start with group 1. So we're going to fade from group 1 into group 2. And while we're going to change some of these parameters in a little bit, the most important one is the animation percentage. The animation percentage controls how far you are blended from group 1 into group 2. Right now that's 0%. If we jack this up to 100, you can see our text disappear. Because group 2 is invisible and it's fading from group 1 to group 2, our text disappears. Next, I don't quite like this soft fade, so you can actually reduce the smoothness, and it will literally do it on a character by character basis, which kind of looks a little bit cooler, in my opinion. You can also increase the randomness, and so the animation won't be perfectly smooth, it'll be a little bit random, just gives a little bit more of an organic feel if that's what you're into. So now let's scrub back to when the title finishes animating, and let's continue scrubbing until the light sweep has passed over our title. And let's start the animation at around 7.5 seconds. Let's reset the animation percentage down to 0, hit the stopwatch icon, let's move forward, maybe about a second to 8.5, and let's jack the animation up to 100. So now what will happen, let's go back a little bit and play this last piece back. Cool, so you've got the title appear, light sweep, and then the title disappears. Now this does look a little bit boring, but fortunately you can simply go into group 2 in Element 3D and mess with the settings and the look of the particles. This way, as they fade out, they change their appearance, and so the final disappear effect just looks a little bit more intricate. For example, if you do have version 2 of Element 3D, you can actually come down into the Deform option, enable Deform, maybe let's add some noise, enable noise and jack up the intensity, to basically distort your characters as they're fading out. If you don't have version 2, or maybe deforming just isn't your slice of pie, let's disable that and maybe we'll just go into the multi-object settings and let's just rotate them a little bit. So that as the text fades out, all of the characters kind of rotate and vanish. Now this is all starting to look pretty good. The last thing we have to do is just fade to black once the title has disappeared. So let's collapse all of our layers. And what I want to do is I kind of want to animate the background to just fade to black, just as the title is about to disappear. So let's start about here as the first character starts to turn. And let's enable keyframes for the color properties, both for the inner and the outer radius. Also, I think I do want to have this highlight kind of sink down like the sun is setting, so let's also enable keyframe for the position property. Let's move forward maybe to about 9 seconds, just after the text has disappeared. And let's set the color for the inner radius to black, the color for the outer radius to black, and let's animate the position downwards. So maybe just off screen. So what will happen is we kind of got a sunsetty effect. So the highlight is moving downwards and everything is turning into black just as the text disappears. Let's rewind and play the whole title back just so we get a feeling for what this looks like. Cool. I think this actually looks really good. Finally, the last thing we need to do to make this title epic and just a little bit more interesting is add some cameras into our scene. As with anything in life, it obviously pays to think this through before you start whacking cameras into your composition. I want to start out the title with 2 short macro shots that just show a single character animating, so the viewers don't get to see the full title yet. It'll create a little bit of mystery and just make it seem a little bit more dramatic. Then I want to have a longer shot of the camera swinging around, the full title gets revealed in the center of the screen. Then we're going to have that cool light sweep effect, and then the title is going to fade out. I actually find it much easier to start with the final camera for the title, so let's create a new camera. I'm actually going to make this a 2-node camera because I know I want to look at the title. Let's call this one Final Camera. Hit OK. Let's rewind to 6 seconds because this is where we want the camera to be in its final position. Reveal the position property on the camera and enable keyframes. Then scrub back further to 4 seconds, which is where we want the camera movement to start. And let's use the Unified Camera tool to move the camera up and above the text so it's looking down. So during this last camera movement, the camera kind of comes swinging around and the final text is going to be revealed. Now, I don't like that the camera actually seems to be getting a bit too close to the text here as it swings around. And if we jump over to the left view, for example, and zoom out, you can see it's actually caused by the camera kind of moving on a straight line between these 2 keyframes. You can see right here in the middle, the camera is getting way too close to the text. So what we can do is we can use the Bezier handles on the start and the end of the motion path for the camera and adjust them to kind of have the camera swing around a little bit more naturally. Yep, I think this looks better. Let's return to the active camera, zoom in and see what this looks like. Cool, that looks a lot better. I'm also going to select the 2 keyframes, hit F9 to turn them into Bezier, just so the animation is a little bit smoother. Now, active camera means it will always use the active camera in your composition, but you can have multiple cameras in your composition. So let's go to 4 seconds and let's trim this layer down to only start at 4 seconds. You can actually hold down Alt and hit left square bracket and it'll trim down the layer nicely up until that point. And we're going to create 2 other cameras for 0 to 2 seconds and 2 to 4 seconds. So let's collapse this. Let's create a new camera. This one, I'm actually going to make a 1-node camera because I just want this to kind of be a really close-up macro shot, and I find the 1-node camera a little bit easier to control. So let's call this macro 1, hit OK. Go back to the beginning of the composition and let's use the camera tool to position the camera really close up to one of the letters. For example, let's zoom the camera in all the way on this O. Cool, I kind of like this move and it's really close to the object, so you kind of it's hard to tell what this is going to spell. And it's going to keep a little bit of mystery. Let's go to 2 seconds and trim down this layer. Maybe I'll move the camera just a little bit more. Yep, that looks nice. And at 2 seconds, let's create yet another camera. Going to call this one Macro 2. Hit OK. And again, let's trim this down. Alt square bracket on the left side. Go to 4 seconds and Alt and right square bracket to trim down the end of this layer. This one again is going to be a macro shot, but I want the camera to be on the right side of the S, looking up and above all of the letters, so the viewer still can't tell what the title actually spells. So let's move the camera forward and into position on the right side of the S. And I think I also want to animate this camera a little bit, just so it kind of swings up to look over the title. Let's go to the 2-second marker, hit P and R to reveal the position and the orientation on the camera layer. Add some keyframes. Let's go forward to 4 seconds and let's move the camera up so it looks above the S. Let's also move the camera forward a little bit and reposition it nicely so it kind of comes up and over the text just as all of the characters are coming together. And yes, let's select these keyframes and hit F9 on our keyboard to enable Bezier interpolation mode. Now, one thing that is going to happen though with these keyframes using Bezier interpolation is that the camera is going to be stationary at first, slowly speed up and come to a complete halt towards the end. As we're cutting between these shots, this is probably not what we want, so I'm actually going to drag these keyframes at the beginning of the camera animation for the second macro shot forward a little bit and move the final keyframes further back so that we're kind of catching the camera in the middle of the movement. It'll just make the shot look a whole lot more dynamic. Finally, let's also go to our final camera. I'm actually going to drag that to the top just so they're a bit more nicely ordered. Hit U on the keyboard and we have exactly the same problem here. The camera starts out not moving at all, so let's drag this forward a little bit. So again, we're kind of catching the camera as it's already moving and the transition will just look a little bit more natural. Let's go back to 0 and let's play this back. Cool, I think this title is coming along pretty nicely. Now, there are two things that I do really want to fix. For one, these textures look really low res, really clunky, and now that we're getting close to the final title, let's jump back into Element 3D. And it's this metal grunge painted that does kind of look rather low res if you get close. As you can see, close up, it really kind of looks ugly and blocky. So what I am going to do is I'm going to select my metal grunge paint material and come down into the texture section. And let's click on the diffuse texture. Right now, the UV repeat option is set to 1, which means the texture repeats one time across the entire 3D model. So let's jack this up to maybe 6 in U and V coordinate, and suddenly you're going to have much more detail in the resolution. Obviously, you're going to have to repeat the process for the specular one as well, so they all line up nicely. So let's jack up the specular one as well, and the bump mapping as well. So U and V repeat set to 6. Obviously adjust this however, it makes it look good on your model. And that's it. Let's exit out the Element 3D editor. And there you go. Doesn't that look a ton better already? One thing that you will definitely notice missing, especially if you've ever done any macro photography, is a very shallow depth of field. Fortunately, that is really easy to enable on our cameras. However, before I do that, I actually want to come into Element 3D one more time, go all the way down to the render settings, expand the render settings, and enable ambient occlusion. Now, have a look at this shot, and as I enable ambient occlusion, what it'll do, it'll basically just add a little bit of shadow into the nooks and crannies of your model, and it'll just make them look a little bit more refined, a little bit more realistic. That's enough about ambient occlusion. Let's get to setting up a really nice shallow depth of field. Let's select the first macro camera, the one that's seeing this shot right now, and press AA on your keyboard. This will reveal the camera options, and in here you will find a depth of field setting. Let's turn this on. Bam! And everything is nice and blurry. Obviously now we still have to set up the focus distance to make sure that the right elements we want are in focus for this shot. Do notice, however, that enabling depth of field will make the rendering pretty slow, even on my machine, so it is something that you really want to leave towards the end of your setup. To make it easier getting the focus distance set up correctly, let's change the active camera over to top view. Move over here, and if you now move the focus distance in, I think this is pretty far out, you can see this is the plane of focus, and you want it to be over the character or over the letter that you want to be in focus. And I want it to be right on the opening of the O. And now if you switch back to the active camera, that doesn't actually look too bad. Maybe I'll increase the focus distance just a little bit more. Cool, so it's just the opening of the O that is in focus. Let's play this back. Cool, this looks nice and dramatic. Obviously the second shot does not use shallow depth of field right now. So let's move on to the second macro camera. Press AA to reveal the camera options. Let's enable depth of field. Again, everything's super blurry, so let's go to the top. And yes, we're way off. I think the focus plane is back here. So let's bring that in. Let me zoom in a little bit. I really want to position this focal plane right on the edge of the S. So about there. Let's change back to the active camera. Still not quite spot on, so let's just tweak the focal distance just a little bit more. Cool, I think that looks about right. Also, because this camera kind of moves up and over the title, I do want to animate the focus distance just so I can control what exactly is in focus during this shot. So let's go back to 2 seconds, the beginning of the shot. Enable keyframing for the focus distance. Let's move forward a little bit. I'm actually really liking this particular shot. Let's just make sure that our focus here is spot on. I think this sequence is going to look really, really cool. Let's move forward a little bit more. The other camera property that we can also animate is the aperture. The aperture controls how deep the field in front of the camera is that is in focus. Right now the aperture is quite large, which gives us a really nice shallow depth of field. So let's go back a little bit to maybe about here. I think this looks really, really good, still with the shallow depth of field. And enable the keyframe on the aperture property. Let's move forward to the end of the shot, just shy of 4 seconds, and let's bring down the aperture. As you can see, suddenly a lot more elements are in focus. So this will give us a really nice transition from a super shallow depth of field to just being able to see a little bit more of what the title might look like. And as before, let's select all of the keyframes. Hit F9 just so we get a little bit of a smoother animation. I think for the final shot I don't actually want any shallow depth of field. I think this actually looks good the way it is. So let's collapse all of our layers. Go back to the very beginning and let's play this back. Cool. I think this is actually coming along really, really nicely. Finally, the very last thing I want to do is I want to create a little bit of a fade in at the beginning of the title and then quick fades between the different camera shots just to add a little bit more drama into the scene. Fortunately, that is going to be super simple. So let's go to the beginning of the composition and let's create a new solid. Obviously make sure this one is black. Let's call this one fade. Hit OK. Make sure that the fade layer is at the very top in your timeline window. Hit T to reveal the opacity property and let's set a keyframe at 100%. Then move forward maybe 12 frames and let's lower the opacity to 0 so we've got a really nice fade in at the beginning. So it starts off really nice and dramatic. Then at about 2 seconds just on this transition, I do want it to be up at 100% and I am going to go back 8 frames, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and reduce the opacity back to 0. And the other side as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 forward. Set it to 0. So you're just going to have a very quick dip to black as the next shot comes in. Just adds a little bit of a drama to it. Let's do the same around 4 seconds. Let's jack the opacity up to 100%. Go back 8 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Set the opacity to 0. And go forward 8 frames from that keyframe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And lower it down to 0. So now again, there's a little dip here and there's a little dip there. So now let's go back to the beginning of the composition, make it really nice and big and play back our final 3D title. And that's all there is to it. Thank you very much for sticking with me through this long tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it, and as always, if you do have any comments, questions or suggestions, just leave them down in the section below. If you did enjoy this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up, favorite it and share it with the world. And if you do want to see more cool filmmaking and visual effects tutorials, don't forget to go to youtube.com/surfacedstudio and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.